Does Buddhism truly reject the ego? The surprising truth about the self. Decoding the concept of egolessness in Buddhism. Years ago, many Buddhist teachers in the West began using the term egolessness to explain the Buddha's teaching on not-self, anattā. Since then, the concept of egolessness has taken on many meanings for different people. Sometimes, egolessness is understood as the absence of arrogance and self-importance, as an attitude of humility, where one does not place their personal identity above all else. Other times, it is seen as a state of pure action, free from personal ambition or selfish gain. However, in its most profound form, the teaching of egolessness asserts that the self we perceive is actually an illusion, that there is no enduring, independent, unchanging I that exists. From this perspective, pursuing happiness based on this illusory self is like chasing an impossible goal. Moreover, clinging to the idea of an independent self can cause suffering not only for ourselves but also for those around us. If we could see through the illusion of the ego and recognize its harmful effects, we would naturally let it go and discover true happiness in the boundless interconnectedness of all things. At least, that is what we are often told, and often with great conviction. The ego, an enemy in the eyes of some Buddhists. When discussing the ego in Buddhism, one striking observation is that many Buddhist teachers, known for their gentleness and compassion, suddenly become harsh when addressing the ego. In many Buddhist writings and discourses, the self is depicted as a major source of suffering, something that must be eradicated for one to attain true enlightenment. Some Buddhist texts and teachers describe the ego in aggressive, almost militant terms. It is portrayed as a tyrant that dominates the mind, a ruthless dictator that needs to be overthrown, a cunning, deceitful rat, always scheming and manipulating, deserving nothing less than extermination. A parasitic force, clinging to our consciousness and feeding off our delusions. Regardless of the metaphor, the message remains the same. The ego is seen as insidious, destructive, and nearly impossible to remove. Because of this, many believe that any form of attack, mental, verbal, or even emotional, is justified if it helps weaken the ego's grip on the mind. But this extreme hostility toward the ego raises important questions. Why is the ego treated as such a severe obstacle in Buddhism? Does Buddhism truly call for its total destruction, or is there a more nuanced understanding? Could this radical rejection of the ego actually be counterproductive in spiritual practice? To answer these questions, we need to examine both the traditional Buddhist perspective on the ego and the ways modern practitioners sometimes take this concept to an extreme. Why is the ego viewed so harshly in Buddhism? The deep suspicion of the ego in Buddhism stems from its fundamental role in perpetuating suffering. According to Buddhist teachings, clinging to the idea of a separate, independent self is the root of all human misery. 1. The ego is the source of suffering. In Buddhist psychology, suffering, dukkha, arises when we crave pleasure and avoid pain because we believe these experiences will define who we are. Develop attachments to our identity, possessions, relationships, or achievements as though they are permanent. Feel threatened when our self-image is challenged, leading to emotions like anger, fear, jealousy, and despair. This belief in a fixed, unchanging self causes us to heavy checkmark chase after fleeting pleasures. Heavy checkmark fear loss, failure, and death. Heavy checkmark experience emotional turmoil when things do not go according to our desires. From this perspective, the ego functions like a prison, trapping us in endless cycles of suffering. The more we cling to it, the deeper our suffering becomes. 2. The ego is an illusion that needs to be seen through. The Buddha taught that the ego is ultimately an illusion, a mental construct with no solid, independent existence. This is the teaching of anattā, not self, which states that there is no fixed, permanent I behind our thoughts and emotions. The sense of self is merely a temporary combination of mental and physical processes, the 5 aggregates or skandhas. Realizing the impermanence of the self leads to liberation from suffering. Because of this, many Buddhist teachings emphasize letting go of the ego to attain freedom, peace, and enlightenment. But does this mean we should violently destroy the ego? This is where some interpretations become extreme. How some Buddhists take ego rejection too far. While the rejection of the ego is a core Buddhist principle, some practitioners take it to an unhealthy extreme. This leads to 2 common yet problematic approaches. 1. Extreme ego suppression, the attempt to annihilate the self. Some people mistakenly believe that any form of personal identity is a problem and try to eliminate all traces of individuality. They may heavy checkmark deny their own thoughts and emotions, believing them to be mere egoic illusions. Heavy checkmark suppress all desires, preferences, and ambitions, fearing they will strengthen the self. Heavy checkmark avoid personal achievements, relationships, or attachments, believing them to be obstacles to enlightenment. This results in a robotic, detached, and emotionally repressed state, where self-expression and healthy human engagement are lost. Some even take this further by adopting extreme asceticism, punishing their bodies and minds in an attempt to completely erase the ego. However, the Buddha himself rejected extreme asceticism, realizing that such an approach only leads to suffering, not liberation. 2. Self-hatred disguised as spirituality. Another harmful interpretation occurs when people confuse egolessness with self-hatred. Some individuals develop a deep hostility toward themselves, believing that their thoughts, desires, and emotions are inherently bad. They must completely reject their personality in order to be good Buddhists. Feeling any sense of self-worth or confidence is a sign of ego attachment. This can result in depression, low self-esteem, and self-loathing. A sense of guilt for having personal desires or ambitions. An inability to set boundaries, leading to being taken advantage of by others. Unfortunately, this kind of toxic spirituality can be reinforced by certain Buddhist communities that promote self-denial without balance. Some practitioners internalize the message that the ego is evil, leading them to suppress their individuality in an unhealthy way. A more balanced perspective: is the ego really the enemy? If we examine the Buddha's original teachings closely, we see that he did not teach violent rejection of the ego. Instead, he encouraged wisdom and mindfulness in dealing with the self. 1. The ego is not the enemy, clinging to it is. The problem is not the ego itself, but our attachment to it. In Buddhist practice, heavy checkmark: the goal is not to destroy the self, but to understand its nature. Heavy checkmark: instead of suppressing emotions, we learn to observe them without attachment. Heavy checkmark: instead of denying our personal identity, we see it as a flexible and impermanent construct. This means that a healthy ego is not an obstacle to enlightenment. An ego that is not grasping, defensive, or rigid is actually a useful tool. 2. Developing a functional ego before letting it go. Paradoxically, before we can let go of the ego, we must first develop a stable, healthy sense of self. This is why Buddhist practice involves ethical conduct, mindfulness, and meditation, which require self-discipline and responsibility. Many great Buddhist teachers exhibit confidence, clarity, and strength. They have not erased their personalities, but rather transcended their attachment to them. Instead of trying to eliminate the ego prematurely, a better approach is to heavy checkmark: develop self-awareness and inner stability. Heavy check mark: recognize the ego's patterns without being controlled by them. Heavy check mark: gradually loosen attachment to identity while still engaging in the world. This approach allows for spiritual growth without self-denial. The extremes of ego denial in Buddhist practice. While Buddhism emphasizes letting go of attachment to the ego, some practitioners and teachers take this idea to an extreme, leading to misinterpretations that can be psychologically and spiritually damaging. The rejection of the ego, when misunderstood, can result in unhealthy forms of self-denial, self-hatred, or even dissociation from reality. Some individuals believe that the path to enlightenment requires the complete eradication of the self. However, such an approach misunderstands the Buddha's original teachings. The Buddha did not instruct his followers to violently reject or suppress the self. Rather, he encouraged a gradual process of insight, awareness, and detachment from false identifications. When ego denial is taken to an extreme, it often manifests in two problematic approaches. Extreme asceticism, the attempt to annihilate the self. Psychological self-destruction, confusing egolessness with self-hatred. Each of these distorted interpretations of egolessness can lead to suffering rather than liberation. Let's examine them in more detail. 1. Extreme asceticism, the attempt to annihilate the self. Throughout history, there have been ascetic movements within Buddhism and other spiritual traditions that interpret egolessness as total self-erasure. This view holds that in order to be truly free, one must completely deny personal identity, renounce all emotions, desires, and attachments, reject all forms of self-expression, comfort, or joy. This belief leads some practitioners to engage in extreme forms of self-denial, such as heavy checkmark fasting excessively to weaken bodily attachment, heavy checkmark avoiding all social interaction to suppress the sense of individuality, heavy checkmark suppressing emotions under the belief that feeling anything is a form of ego clinging, heavy checkmark engaging in prolonged silence to erase the need for self-expression, heavy checkmark deliberately rejecting pleasure as though all happiness is a trap of the ego. Historical examples of extreme asceticism. Before his enlightenment, the Buddha himself experimented with extreme asceticism. He engaged in severe practices, including eating only a single grain of rice per day, holding his breath until he nearly lost consciousness, sleeping on beds of thorns, meditating in extreme weather without protection. Despite his dedication, these practices only brought him suffering, weakness, and frustration. Eventually, he realized that self-mortification was not the path to liberation. He then formulated the middle way, Majjhima Patipada, a path that avoids both self-indulgence and self-torture. However, despite the Buddha's own rejection of extreme asceticism, some Buddhist practitioners today continue to believe that total ego annihilation requires extreme self-denial. In some monastic traditions, ascetics completely withdraw from society, believing that any form of worldly engagement is an illusion that strengthens the ego. While renunciation can be beneficial when done mindfully, when taken too far, it can lead to crossmark physical harm due to excessive deprivation, crossmark emotional numbness from repressing natural feelings, crossmark a sense of superiority, ironically reinforcing the ego in a new way. Ironically, the desire to destroy the self is still a desire, one that is fueled by egoic striving. Instead of freeing the mind, extreme asceticism can create new forms of attachment, as one becomes obsessed with the idea of having no ego. The middle way, as the Buddha taught, acknowledges that spiritual progress requires balance, not self-torture. 2. Psychological self-destruction, confusing egolessness with self-hatred. Another extreme occurs when people misinterpret egolessness as a form of self-hatred or self-negation. Some practitioners heavy checkmark view all personal desires as selfish and attempt to suppress them. Heavy checkmark feel guilty for experiencing emotions like anger, sadness, or ambition. Heavy checkmark believe they must erase their identity to be truly spiritual. Heavy checkmark judge themselves harshly whenever they notice ego-driven thoughts. This approach often leads to psychological distress, self-doubt, and even depression. Instead of cultivating inner peace, practitioners may develop a deep sense of inadequacy, feeling that they are never spiritual enough because their ego has not yet disappeared. The danger of toxic spirituality. In some Buddhist communities, there is a culture of suppressing individuality in the name of egolessness. Practitioners are told to never assert personal opinions, always defer to senior monks or teachers, give up all personal boundaries, mistaking submission for humility, never show personal ambition, even in beneficial ways. While humility is important, erasing personal identity completely is not the goal of Buddhism. True wisdom lies in understanding the nature of the self, not in hating or rejecting it. When egolessness is taken to this extreme, it can lead to low self-worth and a lack of confidence, difficulty making decisions or setting personal goals, a tendency to let others manipulate or take advantage of them. In some cases, individuals with a history of trauma, low self-esteem, or abusive pasts are drawn to Buddhist teachings because they already have a negative self-image. Instead of finding healing, they may use Buddhism as a way to justify their self-loathing. For example, if someone already believes, heavy checkmark I am worthless, heavy checkmark I don't deserve happiness, heavy checkmark I should erase myself because I am the problem, they may latch onto Buddhist teachings not to transcend suffering, but to reinforce their self-hatred. This is a serious misinterpretation of the Dharma. True egolessness does not mean rejecting oneself, it means realizing that the self is not fixed, and therefore, suffering is unnecessary. A more balanced approach to egolessness. Instead of extreme ego denial, a more skillful and balanced approach to Buddhist practice involves 1. Understanding, not fighting, the ego. Heavy checkmark the ego is not inherently bad, it is simply a mental process that helps us navigate the world. Heavy checkmark the goal is not to destroy the ego but to see through its illusions. Heavy checkmark instead of suppressing desires and emotions, we learn to observe them with mindfulness. 2. Developing a healthy sense of self first. Heavy checkmark paradoxically, before we can let go of the ego, we must first develop a stable and healthy one. Heavy checkmark a well-integrated ego allows us to function in society, set boundaries, and practice ethics. Heavy checkmark many great Buddhist masters had strong, confident personalities, not because they clung to the ego, but because they understood how to use it skillfully. 3. Following the middle way. Heavy checkmark avoid self-indulgence, excessive pleasure-seeking that strengthens attachment. Heavy checkmark avoid self-mortification, harming oneself in an attempt to destroy the ego. Heavy checkmark instead, cultivate wisdom, mindfulness, and self-compassion. True spiritual growth comes from insight and balance, not from forcing the self into oblivion. Why do some people have an extreme view of the ego? The idea that the ego is the root of suffering is a central theme in many Buddhist teachings. However, some people take this concept to an extreme, believing that the ego must be completely eradicated at all costs. This radical rejection of the ego can lead to misunderstandings, psychological distress, and unhealthy spiritual practices. But why do some individuals develop such an extreme stance against the ego? What causes them to interpret egolessness, anattā, in a way that leads to self-denial, emotional suppression, or even self-hatred? There are several key factors that contribute to this extreme view, including misunderstanding the Buddhist concept of not-self, anattā, the influence of Western psychology and individualism, the impact of personal trauma and low self-esteem, the pressure of spiritual idealism in Buddhist communities, the influence of extreme ascetic traditions. By exploring each of these factors, we can gain a clearer understanding of how and why some people misinterpret the role of the ego in Buddhism. 1. Misunderstanding the Buddhist concept of not-self, anattā. One of the most common reasons for extreme ego rejection is a fundamental misunderstanding of the Buddhist teaching of anattā, not-self. In many Buddhist traditions, practitioners are taught that the self is impermanent and constantly changing. Clinging to a fixed sense of identity causes suffering. The realization of not-self leads to freedom and enlightenment. However, some people misinterpret these teachings to mean heavy checkmark the self is bad and must be destroyed. Heavy checkmark having any personal identity is an obstacle to awakening. Heavy checkmark I must completely suppress my emotions and desires to achieve enlightenment. This misunderstanding can lead to harmful behaviors, such as repressing emotions instead of understanding them, suppressing individuality rather than engaging with the world skillfully, rejecting all forms of personal ambition, even when they are beneficial. In reality, the Buddha did not say, destroy the ego immediately. Instead, he encouraged a gradual process of self-inquiry and insight, learning to see through the illusion of a permanent self, rather than violently rejecting one's natural human experience. Egolessness is not about erasing identity, it is about realizing that identity is fluid, flexible, and not an ultimate truth. 2. The influence of Western psychology and individualism. The way Buddhism is interpreted in the West differs greatly from how it is understood in Asian cultures. In Western psychology, the ego is seen as a necessary and healthy part of the mind. It is responsible for self-awareness, decision-making, and balancing emotions. In Buddhism, the ego is viewed as a construct that causes suffering when clung to. When Western practitioners encounter Buddhist teachings about not-self, they may overreact by trying to eliminate their ego entirely, believing that they must let go of their personality, goals, and preferences to be good Buddhists. This often happens because heavy checkmark Western cultures emphasize individualism, so the idea of surrendering the ego feels radical. Heavy checkmark many Westerners come to Buddhism seeking an escape from personal struggles, which makes them more prone to rejecting their own identity. Heavy checkmark some Buddhist teachings, when taken out of context, sound extreme, reinforcing the belief that the self must be destroyed. However, in many Asian Buddhist traditions, not-self is understood less literally. Instead of trying to eliminate personal identity, many practitioners simply learn to relate to it with wisdom and detachment. This suggests that the problem is not the ego itself, but our unhealthy attachment to it. 3. The impact of personal trauma and low self-esteem. Some people come to Buddhism not out of curiosity or philosophical interest, but because they are suffering deeply. People with a history of trauma, abuse, or low self-worth may already feel that they are not enough or worthless. When they hear Buddhist teachings about not-self, they may interpret them as confirmation that they should reject themselves entirely. Instead of using Buddhism as a path to healing, they use it to reinforce their self-loathing. For example, if someone has internalized messages such as, heavy checkmark I am not lovable, heavy checkmark I do not deserve happiness, heavy checkmark I should disappear because I am a burden, They may interpret egolessness as heavy checkmark, I must erase myself completely. Heavy checkmark, any sense of personal identity is a mistake. Heavy checkmark, if I try to love myself, I am being egotistical. This self-destructive approach to Buddhism can lead to depression, dissociation, and emotional numbness, the exact opposite of what the Buddha intended. In truth, a healthy sense of self is necessary before one can truly let go of attachment to identity. 4. The pressure of spiritual idealism in Buddhist communities. Many Buddhist communities, especially monastic traditions, place great emphasis on humility, selflessness, and detachment. Practitioners are often taught to not take things personally and to let go of self-importance. While these teachings are valuable, they can be misunderstood or misapplied. Some people begin to believe that having any personal desires, ambitions, or opinions is a sign of spiritual failure. This can create an environment where heavy checkmark people suppress their emotions to appear more enlightened. Heavy checkmark individuals become afraid to express themselves, fearing they will be judged as too egoic. Heavy checkmark spiritual leaders and teachers unintentionally reinforce a culture of extreme self-denial. While selflessness is an important Buddhist value, it should not come at the cost of losing one's humanity or sense of agency. True spiritual growth is not about erasing oneself, it is about learning to engage with the world from a place of wisdom and compassion. 5. The influence of extreme ascetic traditions. Throughout history, many Buddhist and non-Buddhist traditions have promoted severe asceticism as a means of overcoming attachment to the ego. Heavy checkmark, some monks and yogis engage in rigorous self-denial, believing that by rejecting all forms of pleasure, they will reach enlightenment faster. Heavy checkmark, others take vows of complete silence, extreme fasting, or physical hardship, thinking that suffering is the key to liberation. While discipline and renunciation can be powerful tools for spiritual growth, extreme asceticism often leads to more attachment rather than less, specifically, attachment to the idea of being egoless. Ironically, the more one tries to destroy the ego, the more one strengthens it through a sense of spiritual superiority or self-martyrdom. The Buddha himself rejected extreme asceticism and instead taught the middle way, a balanced approach that avoids both self-indulgence and self-torture. How to avoid extremes in ego rejection? Rather than forcing the ego into oblivion, a more skillful approach to Buddhist practice involves heavy checkmark, understanding that the ego is not the enemy, it is simply a mental process. Heavy checkmark, recognizing that a healthy sense of self is necessary before one can truly let go of attachment. Heavy checkmark, practicing mindfulness to observe the ego without being controlled by it. Heavy checkmark, embracing the middle way, which allows for both self-discipline and self-compassion. By cultivating wisdom and balance, practitioners can develop a healthy relationship with the ego, one that is neither attached nor in conflict with it. Ultimately, the goal of Buddhism is not to destroy the self, but to realize that we were never bound by it in the first place. How to develop a balanced approach to the ego? Many people misunderstand the Buddhist concept of egolessness, anattā, believing that they must completely destroy the ego to achieve enlightenment. However, Buddhism does not advocate for the violent suppression of the self. Instead, it teaches us to develop a wise and skillful relationship with the ego. A balanced approach to the ego involves neither clinging to it nor rejecting it outright. Instead, it requires understanding its role, using it skillfully, and eventually letting go of attachment to it in a natural and healthy way. But how do we do this in practice? A mindful and balanced approach to the ego involves 3 key steps. Understanding the ego instead of fighting it. Developing a healthy ego before letting it go. Following the middle way, avoiding both ego obsession and ego rejection. By applying these principles, we can develop a harmonious relationship with the self, allowing for spiritual growth without self-denial. 1. Understand the ego instead of fighting it. Many Buddhist practitioners make the mistake of treating the ego as an enemy. They assume that any thought about I or me is inherently bad, and as a result, they try to suppress or eliminate their sense of self as quickly as possible. However, the ego is not something that needs to be destroyed, rather, it is a natural part of the human experience. What is the ego, really? From a psychological and Buddhist perspective, the ego is heavy checkmark, a mental process that helps us navigate the world. Heavy checkmark, a collection of thoughts, emotions, and memories that create a sense of identity. Heavy checkmark, not an independent, unchanging entity, it is fluid, impermanent, and constantly evolving. When we misunderstand the ego, we may fall into extremes, either clinging to it too tightly, leading to arrogance, selfishness, and attachment, or rejecting it too harshly, leading to self-hatred, confusion, and emotional suppression. A healthier approach, observing the ego with mindfulness. Instead of treating the ego as an enemy, we should observe it with curiosity and awareness. Small blue diamond, notice how the ego arises in daily life. When do you feel proud? Defensive? Competitive? Anxious? Small blue diamond, ask yourself, is this thought or feeling useful? Does it help or harm your well-being? Small blue diamond, recognize that the ego is not permanent, it changes from moment to moment, just like everything else. Through meditative awareness and mindfulness, we can learn to see the ego clearly, not as something to be feared or destroyed, but as something to understand and work with skillfully. 2. Develop a healthy ego before letting it go. A common misconception is that one must abandon the ego immediately to be truly enlightened. However, this ignores an important truth. Small blue diamond, before you can let go of something, you need to develop a healthy version of it first. This is why Buddhist practice does not begin with dissolving the ego, but rather with ethical living, wisdom, and mental training, all of which require a well-balanced sense of self. Why a healthy ego is necessary for spiritual growth. A healthy ego is heavy checkmark, stable enough to make wise decisions. Heavy checkmark, confident enough to take responsibility for one's actions. Heavy checkmark, humble enough to admit mistakes and learn from them. Heavy checkmark, flexible enough to adapt to change and uncertainty. On the other hand, an unhealthy ego is crossmark, fragile and easily offended. Crossmark, overly attached to external validation. Crossmark, fearful of criticism or failure. Crossmark, either overly self-important or excessively self-hating. How to cultivate a healthy ego. Instead of rushing to eliminate the ego, we should focus on developing a well-integrated and stable sense of self by practicing heavy checkmark, self-reflection, understanding our values, strengths, and weaknesses without self-judgment. Heavy checkmark, emotional intelligence, learning how to manage emotions wisely instead of suppressing them. Heavy checkmark, ethical conduct, sila, developing integrity, honesty, and kindness in our relationships. Heavy checkmark, resilience, facing challenges with patience and wisdom rather than avoidance. Once the ego becomes strong yet flexible, stable yet non-attached, it is much easier to let go of its grip naturally, because we no longer feel the need to cling to it for security or self-worth. 3. Follow the middle way, avoiding both ego obsession and ego rejection. One of the Buddha's greatest insights was the middle way, Majjhima Padapada, a path of balance between two extremes. When it comes to the ego, there are two dangerous extremes to avoid. Extreme 1, clinging to the ego, self-obsession. Some people inflate their sense of self, believing they are more important than others. They may Crossmarks seek constant validation and become dependent on external approval. Crossmark hold rigid personal identities, refusing to change or adapt. Crossmark react defensively when their views or beliefs are challenged. This extreme leads to attachment, arrogance, and suffering. Extreme 2, rejecting the ego, self-negation. Others go to the opposite extreme, believing that they must erase all personal identity to be good Buddhists. They may. Crossmark suppress emotions instead of processing them. Crossmark avoid making personal choices, believing desire is bad. Crossmark feel guilty for experiencing happiness, ambition, or pride. This extreme leads to self-denial, depression, and disconnection from life. The middle way, a wise relationship with the ego. A balanced approach does not involve inflating or erasing the ego, but rather seeing it for what it is, a tool that can be used wisely or unwisely. Heavy checkmark recognize that the ego is useful for functioning in society, but not an ultimate reality. Heavy checkmark engage with the world skillfully, having goals, relationships, and emotions without becoming attached to them. Heavy checkmark cultivates self-awareness, understanding the patterns of the ego without falling under their control. Heavy checkmark use meditation to develop insight, seeing that the ego is not a fixed entity, but a fluid and changing process. By following the middle way, we develop a lightness of being, one where we can engage with life fully while remaining free from egoic suffering. The ego is a tool, not an enemy. A balanced approach to the ego does not involve destroying it, suppressing it, or inflating it. Instead, it involves heavy checkmark understanding the ego's nature, that it is neither inherently bad nor inherently real. Heavy checkmark developing a stable, healthy sense of self, before attempting to let go of attachment to it. Heavy checkmark following the middle way, avoiding both ego obsession and ego rejection. In the end, the goal of Buddhism is not to eliminate the self, but to realize that we were never bound by it in the first place. When we stop clinging to the ego, we experience freedom, wisdom, and peace, not because we have destroyed the self, but because we finally understand it as it truly is.